Right before we jump into this video, if you haven't signed up for the Phronos Photo email list, just look for this orange box over on the website, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I will send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations. Jared Polin, phronosphoto.com, and this is a hands-on preview of the brand new Canon EOS R and a bunch of their new RF lenses for the R system. Now we're out here in Hawaii because Canon flew out a bunch of press people to get a hands-on first look at using the production camera and some pre-production lenses. Now I know I still sound like I have a cold. It's because I still have a cold. My hair is down because I went swimming and it felt wonderful. Now keep in mind, this isn't the spec video. We already put out a spec video, so if you're looking for that, the link is down below. I also can't call this a review just yet because we can't open the RAW files in Lightroom. I needed to cut in here real quick and say when I got back from Hawaii, I was able to get access to a RAW converter. So I was able to take 8 files that were CR3s, convert them into DNG so I could open and look at them inside of Lightroom. So what I've done is I put a link down below to 8 RAW files that you can open in Lightroom to determine whether or not you like them or you don't like them. Now let's get back to Hawaii and the preview. We will be doing a real-world review when we get home, and then we can give you our full thoughts at that point. But I also want to let you know that Steven is filming this review with a Canon EOS R. Most of the video was shot with the Canon 24-105 f4IS RF lens. Now Steven's shooting with it right now with the 50mm 1.2 somewhere around f2.8. So if you're looking to see how the video quality looks, you'll see it throughout this video. The only thing that we couldn't do is connect our Atomos to the camera so that you would see exactly what I was shooting, because it doesn't allow us to mirror the video in the EVF as well as record it to the external recorder. So I did put a GoPro on top of the camera. You'll get to see that view as well. So the first thing that I did when I picked up this camera and started to set it up was put it into RAW. But I actually had to put it into RAW plus JPEG, so all of the images that you're going to see in this preview are edited full-res JPEGs in Lightroom, and honestly, they look pretty good. So after I made that switch, I went through the menu system. If you've ever shot with a Canon, it's really easy to set up. It's basically the same thing that you've seen in all of your Rebels, all the way up to the 5D Mark IV and the 1DX Mark II. It basically works the same way, except with new features for a mirrorless camera. But one thing that they've caught up with Nikon and Sony is the fact that you can map a lot of the buttons and set them custom to whatever feature it is that you want to use. So how does the camera feel? The camera feels amazing in my hands. Now, the first thing that I noticed when I picked it up is that Canon didn't design this to be a small, dainty, mirrorless camera. We've seen the race to the smallest and lightest for a long time, and now that's starting to come back up because once you put on their big glass, you don't need to have such a small body. So I was very happy to see that Canon went ahead and built a body that feels like a DSLR, but has the added features of what a mirrorless camera gives you. It's built tough, it feels heavy, it feels substantial, but it also feels great in the hands. Canon did a great job setting up a bunch of photo shoots for us to test out the camera and the lenses. Now, the first shoot that we did ended up being on the beach with some surfers. There was a guy, there was a girl, there were some surfboards. There was also a lot of wind and a lot of sand, you know, because it's a beach and there's sand on it. You may notice that there's a record button at the top of this camera, but what happens when you hit that when you're shooting stills? Well, it's set to your C3 custom setting, meaning whatever you set that to, whenever you hit that record button, even when you're shooting stills, it will start shooting video to the exact settings that you set. This is great for hybrid shooters who want to go back and forth quickly without having to go into the mode dial. So to start off, I had the brand new 28-70 f2. Now, they only had 7 of them here at the trip, and I made sure that I got one to use all day because it is a beast. It truly is a beast of a lens. It's going to be $3,000. But what I wanted to do was get some photojournalistic candid style shots. The guy was with the surfboard just sitting there. The girl came down, sat next to him, and I was just shooting like I was shooting with a DSLR. It just felt natural. And the first thing that I noticed is that my focus points, the box, went all the way and touched the top of the frame. It went all the way and touched the bottom of the frame. It went all the way to the right, except for one little square, and all the way to the left, almost to the entire edge and was just one square off. So you do have access to 5,655 autofocus points. But keep in mind, they don't all light up inside of the camera. They're just there and you can access them. Speaking of focusing points, how do you move them? Well, you can move them from the back of the LCD. In my case, I set it to the bottom right of the screen and I just slide my finger around and you can quickly move the focusing points. You also can set the D-pad to allow you to move the focusing points, but I found that that was really slow. It took a while to activate and then I press the button and I'm sitting there pressing, and it's moving slowly across the screen. But what I will say is that I wish it had a joystick. It is missing a joystick right where my thumb lives. Same thing when I shoot vertical. There's no joystick, so it's a little more difficult to move the focusing points because your thumb wants to go to right where the joystick should be, and it's not actually there. But when you do shoot vertical, there's something interesting that happens inside the camera, is that all of your settings go to the bottom, and they're right side up instead of sideways where you have to read them on the side of the viewfinder. IBIS. Where is IBIS? It's missing from this generation of camera. Now, Steven used this camera with an IS lens and said that running around, it's not as stable as when he's using any of the Sonys that have IBIS built in. So that's why it's a little more shaky. IS isn't just good enough anymore, but in combination with IBIS, it's gonna give you better, more stable video when you're moving. One of the very first things I noticed when I started taking pictures, now keep in mind, I was using the mechanical shutter, is that when I took a picture, I didn't have any viewfinder blackout. And I'm sitting there going, how is this possible that the shutter comes down and I'm not losing sight of my subjects? For some reason, it just works. No matter how many pictures you take with the mechanical shutter, I don't see any blackout happening at all. Now, this camera does have the ability to shoot with an electronic shutter, of course, because it's mirrorless, but I didn't do a lot of electronic shooting with this camera because right now, you only have the ability to shoot one frame in single shot with the electronic shutter. They're saying that in a couple of months there will be a firmware that will allow you to shoot multiple frames, but in this case it doesn't let you do it right now. But in the simple tests and the quick shots that I did inside, it did work well, except you just get one shot. Now, if you're wondering how do you know that you're taking the picture, well, a white box shows up around the outside of the frame so you know when you're taking a picture. Something I noticed when I wanted to switch to shooting with the electronic shutter real fast is that if I was in continuous shooting with the mechanical shutter, the option for electronic shutter was not available. It was grayed out. The only way to get it from grayed out to on is I have to go into single shot and then go and activate the electronic shutter. So hopefully they change that with an upgrade to the firmware. So basically this camera is not ready for silent shooting unless you just want to shoot one shot at a time. One of the features for video that this camera's missing are zebra lines. So Steven had to rely on the histogram inside of the EVF to make sure that his exposure wasn't blown out. If he had the zebra lines, he would be able to see it perfectly because there'd be zebras running through his viewfinder. I do want to mention that once you hit record, the histogram goes away, and that's a big issue, especially when light's changing and you need to react quickly. One thing that was unique that we saw when shooting video with this camera is that you could change your f-stops by more than just a third of a stop to 1/8 of a stop. So that helps if you need to fine-tune your exposure and your aperture. When I was done getting a couple of those candid shots with the model sitting there, it was time to switch lenses to the 70-200 EF, which means I needed to break out the adapter to adapt that lens to this body. It also means I need to take the lens off of this camera on the beach where it's awfully windy and sand might be flying around. You will be pleasantly surprised to find that when you take the lens off, the shutter has come down to cover up the sensor, protecting it more so than if it didn't come down at all. So that was a great feature that Canon put into this body. The reason I switched over to the 70-200 is because I wanted to use an adapter with the EF lens onto this EOS R body. I want to see how the autofocus would handle because a lot of people are going to take their EF lenses and mount them on the mirrorless camera using an adapter. The first thing I noticed about the autofocus is that I didn't notice that it was autofocusing. It worked so seamlessly and well, it felt like a DSLR, and that's a great testament to what Canon has done with this camera, is the fact that the autofocus just autofocused. I didn't see it hunting, it didn't feel any different than what the DSLRs offered me in the past. So a good test for the autofocus with an adapted lens is to have the model run down the beach through the surf, through the sand to see how the camera did and how it handled the autofocus. For the most part, it tracked her very well. It did miss on occasions, and as she got closer and I was fumbling with trying to move the focusing points, I kind of missed, and that's where the camera didn't do as good of a job acquiring focus. There should be a joystick so that I could more quickly move the focus points, but for the most part, it tracked very well. It was quick, and I suspect that whatever lens that you put on there, it should work well with the EF adapter. Canon tells you that this camera will shoot 8 frames a second, and it will if you lock the focus in. Now, with the subject running towards me, I was getting 5.5 frames a second with continue autofocus. That's a lot of frames a second. It's not a ton, it's not too few, it's in a good spot. Some people may want more, but remember, if you can't get the shot in one shot, you probably shouldn't be shooting at all. So with shooting a lot of images in a row, how is the buffer in the camera? Well, you get 47 RAW files in a row. Now keep in mind, I was shooting RAW plus JPEG, and it's all going to one SD card. I hate the fact that they built a bigger camera with one SD card. There's no reason why it shouldn't have 2 SD cards at this point. And I'm also tired of hearing that, well, it's not a pro camera, so it doesn't need 2 slots. That's bullshit. Any camera in the right person's hands can be a pro camera. Since we had the model running down the beach already, Steven switched in to shoot 120 frames a second at 720 and quickly realized that it does not do autofocus while you're recording. The Sony does autofocus. It does 1080 at 120. That gives you that option, and the Canon doesn't. One of the more disappointing features in this camera is the fact that it doesn't shoot full frame 4K. It's a 1.7x crop. Now for that, Steven used the 24-105, and in certain situations where he needed to be in a smaller area, he had to step further back, which makes it more difficult. But if you own EFS lenses and adapt it to this camera, you will get a wider field of view. One of the features that a lot of people love having in a camera, especially one that could be an amazing vlogging camera, is a flip out rotatable screen that I'm having trouble getting out right now. This camera has it. It could have been one of the greatest Vloggy McVloggerson cameras in the world, except for the fact that you have cropped 4K. But as a still shooter, I don't find myself using this flip out screen very much, but it helped Steven to get lower angles when he was shooting lower to the ground. So again, having that flip out screen is perfect when you're shooting video. Since I already had the 70-200 on the camera, I wanted to do some portraits, so we moved to a shaded area under a tree because this would give me a good chance to use that 70-200, try the eye focus to see if it focuses well using the eye tracking, and also switch around to a bunch of different lenses. One of my favorite features in the Sony cameras is IAF because it works really well. Now Canon has something similar to that in this camera, but it is limited to just single shot right now until there is a firmware upgrade. That means you can find the eye, take one picture, take your finger off, take another picture, but you can't shoot rapid to make sure that you are nailing your focus. Now, I also noticed as soon as the subject turned their head, you lost IAF. So the IAF in the Canons, it's not quite ready for prime time. Now let's talk about the electronic viewfinder, or EVF. When I looked through the EVF, I didn't sit there and say, wow, it looks like I'm looking at a TV screen. It honestly looked so good that it reminded me of shooting with an optical viewfinder, except with the added benefits of seeing my exposure, of seeing all of the different functions and features that I'm selecting right inside of the viewfinder. So even in bright light, the EVF worked extremely well. One thing that Steven pointed out to me when he was shooting video is that he felt there was a little bit of lag when you went from the EVF to using the LCD screen and back again. For me, just shooting stills using the EVF all day, I didn't really notice it, but it is something that does exist. Let me jump in here real quick and say if you're looking to pick up anything EOS R related, there's a link down below for you to pre-order or order from Adorama. So now let's get back to the video. Next up, I switched over to the 50mm 1.2 RF lens. That's a native lens for this EOS R body to do some close focused portraits. I could get super close to the model without upsetting her because I checked first that I could get close. I warned her, I'm getting close, and then I focused right in on the eye. And it was so tack sharp. I haven't seen something this sharp in a long time, and that's even looking at the JPEGs. So I can't wait to look at the RAW file. The portraits just look great out of this camera. So after shooting with the 50-1.2, Steven said, well, you got a 28-70 f2. Why don't you try some portraits at 70 millimeters at f2 to see how it worked? Because generally with the 24-70, I'm not using that for portraits as much, the 2.8, but with this at 70 at f2, you could use it for shooting portraits. Moving on to the next setup of the day, we went to where Lindsay Adler had set up a studio with strobes for us to shoot. Now, we were a little early, so I went and did some candid photos of the model getting her makeup done. This is kind of interesting because it's like what you would be doing before a wedding. I got to bump the ISO up just a little bit and shoot with the 11-24 f4. Now, normally I don't do a lot of studio strobe work, but in this case, Lindsay had an awesome set already set up and she told me all of my settings. So I plugged right in to the sync port right here so I could trigger the strobes, and I started shooting with the 70-200 as well as the 28-70, and the sample images give you a good look at the sharpness, the clarity, as well as the color. Speaking of the color and clarity in this camera, I do want to let you know that we did verify that the 30.3 megapixel sensor in this camera is the same sensor that you will find in a 5D Mark IV. Now keep in mind there's a Digic 8 processor in here, so there's some changes and tweaks that have been made, especially to the ISO, to give you a little bit more range. Now you may be saying, why are they using old technology? Well, let me point out that the Sony a7R III uses an older sensor from the a7R II, but they made tweaks to the camera's computers to allow you to pull more quality out of those sensors. One of the things that I love about Canon cameras is dual pixel AF. Now, Steven used dual pixel AF to continuously focus on me for the entire shoot when he was running and gunning, and it just worked. Now, I didn't do a lot of low light shooting because most of the setups that they had for us were in the bright sunny day. But knowing that this is the same sensor that the 5D Mark IV has, and knowing that we've pushed that during its real world review, we know that it's going to handle low light very well. One of the things you have to do in the studio when you're using the strobe is deactivate the live preview inside of the viewfinder that changes and shows you whether your exposure is right or wrong because you're shooting with the flash. So what it does is just lets you see the bright scene, but it's not an exact representation of what the image is going to look like because you're popping off that strobe. So it was cool to have an entire setup already done for me with a professional model who every time I took a picture gave me one of these, gave me one of these, and then definitely gave me one of these. One of the things that we wanted to test out was the adapter that allows you to put ND filters or circular polarizers onto any EF lens. So that means with an 11-24, where you don't really have a filter that you could put on the outside, you can now put a filter on that lens to get some cool shots. So I gave Steven the camera and he got some photos using that adapter. One thing that Steven relayed back to me is that he had his white balance locked in with the adapter and that filter, and he would take one picture, it would look perfect with the right color balance, then he'd take another one right after, and the color balance had shifted. Now keep in mind, this is a pre-production adapter, but it really shouldn't be shifting from picture to picture, especially when you lock in your color balance. If you're a video shooter and you're going to adapt lenses to this camera, you're gonna love the fact that you can change the ND filter just by turning the little knob at the adapter. One of the biggest questions with mirrorless cameras is, how's the battery life? Well, in this case, I used a grip all day, Steven used a grip all day, and you can put 2 batteries in there. I only dropped about 20% on both batteries, and Steven shot all day, probably 5-6 hours, with the camera constantly on, which means the live view is always on, and it didn't overheat, and he used about 40% of the battery in each one of the batteries in the grip. One of the things that people tend to do out there is read the CIPA rating and go, well, this camera sucks, it gets 300 shots on a battery charge. But in the real world, you're getting a hell of a lot more than that. So don't just read the specs, look for people that actually use the camera in the real world. There's a new touch-sensitive multi-function bar built into the back of the camera. Now this can be programmed with so many different features and functions, but as a photographer, I set it to ISO to quickly be able to switch around, and what I found is that I was accidentally hitting that button, which means it was changing ISO to stuff that I didn't want it to be. Now you can lock it, but if you do lock it, you have to press on it for 2 seconds. And by that time, I could have just hit the dedicated button to change ISO with a press and a turn of a dial. But on the video side, it does come in handy. Steven used the left side of the button to punch in to make sure his focus was right, and he used the right side to pause the servo autofocus. We're now shooting this camera using C-Log, which is giving you internal 8-bit. Now C-Log is going to give you more of an ability to color grade your file when you're in post. Now we're recording externally to an Atomos recorder, which is 10-bit 422. So you tell me how it looks. Now let's test out the face detection at f1.2. Oh yeah, we're also using an ND filter, but it doesn't seem to be affecting it. I go back, I go up, I go this way, I go that way. Yeah, how's it look? So there's a couple of big questions we're left with now that Canon has this mirrorless camera. One of those is, if you're a Canon shooter, do you go with a 6D or something like this? Now I think that this camera falls above the 6D but below the 5D Mark IV. But it also begs the question, is the DSLR dead? I think in the next 3 years, you're gonna find the answer to be yes, because most of the features that you're finding in these mirrorless cameras are in DSLRs, and then you get more features that are even better than what the DSLRs can offer. I was pleasantly surprised when I picked up this camera that it felt great in my hands. It was substantial, it was built well, the grip feels great, it works really well, and the autofocus just focused. That's one of the people's main concerns, is how's the autofocus? Well, it worked really well. But I do have to say that this camera is a little crippled at the beginning because you're gonna need a firmware upgrade to allow you to shoot silent continuous. The fact that it doesn't do that right off the ripper Magoo is not a good thing. You should have gotten that one right, Canon. You know that the point of a mirrorless camera is to shoot silent, and the fact that I get one shot and then have to press the button again and again without taking a quick bunch of snaps is not really what the mirrorless is about. But I do think there will be at least 2 more cameras in the next year. You're probably gonna see a 5D Mark IV version, and then you're gonna start to see a 1DX Mark II style camera. Canon alluded to the fact that there's more on the way. I do think it's the death of the DSLR on the way, and this camera so far, even though when I talked about the specs in the first place was a little hesitant and a little upset, once I started shooting, because Canon put production cameras in our hand and gave us a great place to shoot, I realized that this camera is pretty good. Again, I want to reiterate that this is not a full-on review. It's a hands-on preview of my experience using this camera for the last couple of days here in Hawaii. So you can look forward to a real-world review in the next couple of months. I probably will wait until the full firmware is out so that we can test out all of the features of the mirrorless camera. But so far, so good. I wasn't expecting that, but I was pleasantly surprised. So let me know what you guys think down below. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. And if you haven't downloaded My Gear Vault, go to mygearvault.com. It's the best way to input, organize, and protect your gear, free for iOS and Android. And that's it. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.